The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and I'm Al Warren. Mr. Dave Martino is here.
Present.
He's in the house.
I'm in the house.
He's in the house. Look out.
I'm in the basement of the House of Mystery.
Yeah. Hey, did you guys watch the Golden Globes?
I did not. No.
You just... You're such a party pooper. Why hasn't your wife left you yet?
I know.
What's going on with that?
I don't understand it myself.
What do you have on her? It's like, what? You know, does she just keep the cat and throw you out?
Yeah, well,
you know,
that could happen, you know.
Well, nothing to see anyway. Golden Globes. Nobody got slapped. That's the main thing.
Oh, well, that's good, right?
You know.
Or maybe not.
Well, slapping made it exciting. It gives them something to talk about. Gives the award show legs. No, nothing too exciting in it anyway. You know, again, I'm going through all this stuff, and maybe I'm just getting too old to care. I don't know. I didn't find too much exciting. You know, I guess they made a joke about Tom Cruise and Scientology that didn't go too well, but
no,
I don't care. You know. Well, anyway, let's move on. So it's Friday. It's the big day of the week, and so now we're going to talk about being double-crossed. You know all about that, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. So we've got an author here called Laury Egan. So she's written a book called Doublecrossed, and let's find out. So, Laury, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you both for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, how did you get into this writing world? As in, like, were you a person that was writing when you were a young little kid and you sort of always loved writing and doing stories and stuff, or was this something that came along later?
Well, the first thing I ever wrote was a poem, and I was 7 years old, and I was sitting in my bathtub, if you can imagine, and I screamed for my mother to please bring me a pen and pencil or something and paper, and she thought, of course, I was really crazy. And then I promptly wrote 4 stanzas. So I started rather precociously, and then I did my first novel when I was 12. And then I wrote short stories and poems in high school. But I switched over into the visual arts for college. I went to Carnegie Mellon, and I don't know why I did this, because I was also accepted at Bennington and Bard in creative writing, which in hindsight I wish I had gone to, as much as I had a great time at CMU. So I didn't really do a lot of writing professionally, but I was in publishing and worked as a book designer and promotion manager, design manager for many years, and freelance. So my background is in publishing, which put me in a very good place to begin my professional writing career, being on the other side of the desk. And I started, I guess, my first book when I was about in my 40s, and then it's really taken off in the last 10 or 15 years.
Wow. So what I should say that I should ask this first. So what was it that actually gave you the, let's say, put the fire under you to actually decide to write professionally?
Well, I think all along, being an only child and sort of a bit of a solitary kid, I think that writing was always something that was very intrinsic to my personality. It was an outlet for me to sort of go through my experience and understand it. And so later in life, when I was beginning to get to the point of retirement from being a book designer, I finally sort of gave myself permission to start writing seriously and in longer form. I did do a lot of short stories and poems, and they were published in literary journals. And then I did a collection of short stories and my first poetry volume. So it just sort of continued from there. And then when my mother died, which was a sad event, obviously, but it was also freeing in the sense that it allowed me not to have her looking over my shoulder and thinking, "Oh, don't write that." So, I really took off when I was a bit older, and have been working very hard ever since.
Well, that's a good thing. So when you said you wished you went to that creative writing instead of what you were doing, do you think it's really important to be, let's say, schooled in writing?
Not necessarily. However, I think that if I had gone to Bennington, for example, with their track record at that time, I would have been, a graduate, and I would have been put into the whole New York City connection through the professors at Bennington, all of whom were published writers. And that would have put me on the path right early on. Whereas when you're trying to get on that path as an older adult or middle-aged adult, it's a lot more difficult, and it still is. So my connections with the university presses, didn't parlay at all into trade publishing or fiction, because I was used to academic publishing. So it was a different kind of experience. And had I gone to be a major in creative writing, I think it would have helped. But I did learn a lot working at Princeton University Press in terms of editing and production, design, etc. So I was fairly knowledgeable.
Yeah, I think it's important, kind of, in some cases anyway. So, so what's your process? How do you decide the idea behind a book, or how do you start to imagine a book when you're going to sit down and write?
Every book is different. There are several of my titles that I can honestly say I sort of channeled a character. One day I was sitting on my deck, for example, and minding my own business, and this voice came in, and he was a young gay guy, an opera singer, and he started chatting, and he was so funny that I rushed into my computer and typed in his name that he gave me and his history, and there he was. And that's happened several times to me, where a character will come through like that, either a name or how he looks or his background. Other times it's a setting. My first book, Jenny Kidd, was set in Venice because I spent quite a bit of time there, and I was fascinated with the dark and the light of the city itself, its beauty and its sort of macabre feeling, once the lights went down. So setting is important. And for this particular book, Doublecrossed, this was sort of a what if kind of start. What if you thought you found the perfect lover? What kind of trouble could you get into with a start like that? So that was really how Doublecrossed came about, pretty much. It was just making me think, well, what kind of situation, would that be, and what would happen?
Yeah. When you say how the setting is important, do you actually create the setting or write the setting as a character?
Usually, yes. A lot of my life, I've also been a fine arts photographer, so the visual is very important to me. And as I say, I also have a background in design. So I often pay a great deal of attention to my surroundings. So Doublecrossed was typical. And I had a house in mind that I had lived in for a short while that I used as one of the characters. And I found that was very useful, and that has often been the case for me. And sometimes I do sketches and drawings so I know where I am in the house and what the house looks like, or do maps, different kinds of visual aids to assist me and to keep me on track, so that I remember which room I'm in or how I get from one place to the other.
Does it matter what city you live in and where it's taken place? Do you have to go there to get the feel of the city or the place that you're writing about?
I prefer to, or, as a photographer, I've often taken a lot of images of different places, so I can rely on those as well as my memory, and then on things online to sort of help me. Like, with Venice, I had maps and guidebooks and things like that. For my newest book, Once Upon an Island, which is set in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands in 1966, believe it or not, I had a great scrapbook that I wrote when I was 16, and I had stuffed a lot of notes in there and bits of writing, and so I had quite a bit of information about that particular place, which was very inspiring for me.
It's interesting. You talk about visualizing, and you have that artistic background, and you're also talking about hearing your characters. And I just find it interesting because we usually have writers who either are very visual or they're more into the being able to hear their characters. But it sounds like you have a balance. Is that correct, that you have a balance between these two, the visual and the audio?
Yes, I think so. And because I have very strong visual, background and strengths, that does help. So if I'm in an environment, I do notice little details, which when you're writing, if you can sort of make a setting sparkle, or by just a little phrase or so, some kind of description that really pins the reader to the place and gives that sense of authenticity to the work, that I think is really important. When you hit that in a book, I think that really makes the reader feel good about trusting the author and to read the work quite happily. So, yeah, I think I am pretty balanced. I do a lot of dialogue, and I work on those very hard because that's something I struggle with, because I tend to truncate dialogue a little bit, so I'm always expanding it. But otherwise, I'd say I am pretty balanced. You're right.
Geez, I'm really unbalanced. Imbalanced. How's that?
I know that feeling.
Yeah. So what comes first? Is it the story, the idea, or is it the character?
Every book is different. Doublecrossed, it was the idea. Once Upon an Island, it was the place and being there when I was 16. And that book, which happens to be my favorite of the 10 novels I've written, that book has a very nostalgic feel because I was there at that time. And I did talk about characters, people I knew. And I, of course, fictionalized them, but that was really important. Other times, it can be a place that sort of gets me going. So all different reasons and for starting a book.
So now, when we look at Doublecrossed, your main characters, like Alexandra Wyatt and Marnie Hardwick, how do you come up with those characters yourself? Are you finding them from people you've met, come across? Were you at a coffee shop one day or a supermarket, or is it sort of a combination of a lot of characters you've met? Like, where do they start?
Well, the Marnie Hardwick character was just slightly based on somebody I knew. But everything else in that story is pretty much fictional, except for the house, which I had lived in for a short while, though I made it a Tudor versus a modern. That story pretty much is 100% imaginary.
You just sort of like dream about them and they come to you, or do you just sort of write it, put it out together, or like do you have an actual relationship with your characters?
Yeah, I think I do. And some of them, those that I channel through whatever process, I get to know them a lot quicker right at the beginning. Other times, like in Doublecrossed, I had to get to know the characters. They had to evolve. So that sort of meant following them as I was writing, so that I got to know them like you would a new friend or a new person in your life that you just met. So in a sense, they start to talk about what they would do, and you begin to understand what fits with their particular personality and their background, and what kinds of things they would or would not do, how they would talk, what they would dress like, all kinds of things. So in many cases, it's a process of getting to know the characters through the whole writing time. And sometimes I have to go back and really adjust things when I feel that the psychology is wrong, if a character would not have behaved in a certain way. I've studied quite a bit of psychology, and I use that a lot in my work. So I try to be very careful and very accurate when I create a particular type of person.
Well, as you're writing, do your characters, do they ever surprise you? Do they kind of take over? Do they go against the plot that you've that you've created in your mind as you're creating the novel?
Well, sometimes, like my comedy, the only comedy I've written, which is called Fabulous, an opera buffa. This was the guy that came to me on the deck, and he was just top speed, madcap funny, and I just was holding on for the ride with him. I mean, he was just so much fun, and I just really hung on to his coattails, so to speak. So I had no idea where that one was going. I just followed his lead. Other books, I've sort of had to go back and change characters a little bit when I got to know them better.
So do you actually hear your characters then?
Those that I've channeled, like Gil in Fabulous definitely had his very, very specific voice. And a guy in another mystery of mine, A Bittersweet Tale, Django Jax, his name appeared to me one morning when I woke up, and when I typed it in, out he came, and I could see he looked a little bit like a Nick Nolte kind of character, and his sort of folksy voice just came to me, and it's not anybody not a voice I know. Nobody I know was like Django Jax. And this also happened with a young adult novel, The Outcast Oracle. Again, not a character I know, not like anyone I know, and with a voice that is completely individual.
You don't hear these voices while you're out driving, do you? Or like this isn't becoming a problem, is it?
Well, I don't know. I guess maybe if I'm thinking about what I'm writing, maybe I do.
You're waking up in the middle of the night with muddy shoes or something, something going on here, we should tell about.
We won't tell anyone.
Yeah, we won't tell anybody.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So when you write a book, okay, so Doublecrossed is out. Now, did you have a, let's say a meaning or something you wanted people to get from the book besides the story or the entertainment part of it or things like that? Is there kind of an underlying subtext or a meaning?
Not as much for this book as some others, but I really like the idea of the title, Doublecrossed. And in a sense, the narrator is not exactly an unreliable narrator, but she's got her own issues. And I think the idea that nobody is quite who they seem, particularly Marnie Hardwick, the lover, obviously, but then there are other layers as the novel progresses. So this is sort of an unpeeling of Alex's history, her past, and how it is all of a sudden crashes into the present. So the idea of characters sort of double-crossing each other and maybe even in a sense slightly misleading the reader also, and another subtle kind of double cross is probably the main theme for this book.
You find in your process, are you the type that sits down and writes out an outline and you're all organized and you can sit down like 9 to 5 and write on any scheduled day, or do you actually have to be in a certain mood?
I write every day where I'm working on some aspect of it, either editing or promoting books, which we now have to do so much of. I am at my desk almost 7 days a week, which is sort of unusual, and it's a real privilege to be able to do that because most people have to work or they have a lot of family obligations that make it impossible. As far as my process goes, I would say that I tend to have, sometimes I have an idea where the goal line is at the end. Other times I really don't. Doublecrossed, I did not. I had somewhat of an idea, but I really didn't. I wasn't really sure. And in fact, I rewrote that ending a couple of times, to say the least. Other times I've got a pretty good idea where I'm going. But it's pretty much organic writing. I don't write an outline. I never have. And I don't sort of make, I don't think too far ahead of myself, because I really want to learn the characters, grow with the characters, see where the characters take me, where the plot goes. And that excites me. That's part of the fun of writing for me, is to surprise myself as much as anybody else.
So is the feeling or mood or things going on around you important? Like, do they influence you in your writing and maybe the story, or maybe some of the characters or their feelings or attitudes?
Occasionally, because I'm on my own now, however, I don't get as many influences as I used to. And I tend to go back a little bit into my past and sort of pluck things out that either situations, places, or characters, people, or problems that I maybe didn't resolve back then. So in that sense, I'm very past oriented these days, partly due to my age, but it just seems to be a natural process.
Well, it's funny, but with things like, like the pandemic and politics and all the stuff going on the outside, even if you're not right in the mix of it, do you think that gets into your writing or influences how you write? Did the pandemic affect your writing?
It really didn't, because I was already pretty much sitting at my desk all day. So my life changed not as much as it did for some people who were out and about and working away from home. I think that there is sort of a negative feel these days across America and in many parts of the world. And that may be why I keep coming back to psychological suspense or mystery, because of its sort of noir quality, its darkness. But then the book I'm working on right now is again another psychological suspense, but it's very psychologically oriented. So yeah, I guess it probably creeps in a little bit in terms of what I choose to write about, but I'm pretty much in my own head and coming up with these things without a lot of influence from the outside.
Do you ever feel vulnerable going back into your past and bringing that into your stories and putting that on the page and then putting it out for the world to see?
Good question, David. I do sometimes. Once Upon an Island in particular, because my mother actually features in the book, and I've made her into more of an ogre than she was. Although we had our tussles then. I was 16, and it was the mother-daughter clash of the century. And as I said earlier, I'm really sort of glad she's not around right now, because oh boy, would I hear about it if she read this book. So in that sense, because I still have friends and relatives that knew my mother, I was a little bit uneasy about having this book published from that perspective, because they knew her, even though I exaggerated her behavior hugely in the book. Sometimes, when you actually do include something that's got a little bit of an autobiographical feel, that can be a little unnerving. Because, some people are going to get the reference.
Right.
Well, and especially nowadays, because in general, people have much easier access to you than they ever would have before, social media and stuff. So it's very easy for people to say and do things online publicly about what you've written. So it's kind of it's a little different, the world today.
Yes, it is. I agree with you. In fact, I don't think that's always a good thing. I was in a book group for quite a few years. And I remember I would do research on some of the authors, and the group would get annoyed with me because they wanted to keep what the author was about and what kind of history and background the author had separate from the book, and just to read the book itself and judge the book on its own merits. And I really do sort of think that that's the way books should be read for the most part. I agree.
Yeah. It's a whole new world, we're living in. But do you take people that you don't like or really bad people and kill them off in your book?
Oh, am I supposed to admit to this, huh?
Yeah. We want names.
Okay.
And phone numbers if you have them too, because we'll call them and tell them to make sure to listen.
Well, let's see here. I have done that on a few occasions, but not too often. As I said, Once Upon an Island, I sort of did get after my mother a bit, but she's not around to know that. But other books, Doublecrossed, the Marnie character, maybe. I was sort of feeling like something had been bothering me over the years, and I wanted to sort of express that. But in most cases, the characters are pretty fresh and new, and not necessarily anybody that I had in my head from or knew from my past.
So when you've completed a book like Doublecrossed or Once Upon an Island, how has it changed you? How do you find that it's affected you?
Well, that's a very interesting question, one I haven't been asked before.
That's what we do.
Let me think.
Especially the island one, I was going to say, because there's personal, and like you're saying, you're kind of working through things as well as the book, like you kind of. So I a lot of times I find that, and I ask people kind of, well, what's that done for you? Did it kind of help? Did it kind of take you along? Like how has it changed you, do you think?
Well, from Once Upon an Island, when I was 16 and on St. Croix with my mother, I just read Lord of the Flies, and I decided it would be very interesting to write a novel about living on an island and why people chose to move to an island and live there, and how would the island affect them. So in many ways, that book had its origins way back when I was a teenager, and it was a promise I made to myself that it took me almost 50 some years to fulfill. But I think when I finished writing that particular manuscript, I had the sense of fulfilling that promise, but the nostalgia stayed with me. And that book, every time I read another round on it or read the proof, I had this feeling of really being torn up. The book really emotionally affected me anew each time. And a number of my readers, and some of whom have either lived on or live on St. Croix, who are about my age, had much the same reaction. So I touched something there that I thought was a time and a place, a people, a culture, but also an experience I had that I think other people also had. So that book has never really, even though I finished it and I did what I said I was going to do, that book still is going to stick with me to the end. I think so. Of any book that I want to live on, that would be it. Doublecrossed, well, perhaps I felt finally I'd had my say about one person I hadn't liked so well. But I don't know. Each book is different, and I tend to put them aside once I finish writing them. They become a book on a shelf to me for the most part, and they are no longer mine in a way. They're out there to be read, but I have a very hard time even getting back into them to talk about them or to answer readers, because it's like the book is already somebody else's. It's out there.
Right. Yeah, I understand that. I feel the same way. So you're never going to go back to one of these books and reread it. in a few years and kind of go, whoa, I should have wrote it this way, or do changes, because there's a lot of writers that want to do that.
I have never been tempted, and in fact, people have often asked me, are you going to write a series or a second volume to book X? And I say, I don't think so. It would really be hard for me to get back into that voice, the tone. And I sort of feel like, I did that already. I want to do something else.
Yeah, and I think once you write a book, once you go through that journey and the book is done, it changed you, and now you're doing something different. You've been there, done that, and you're moving on. So I think that's kind of that feeling too, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I've never reread any of my books, to be honest. I've reread a few short stories because I had to, pull them together for an anthology or something like that. But other than that, no, I haven't reread any of them. And I don't think
it's a
I
scary
will.
process. No, it's terrible. I'll tell you.
Go back to your first book.
Go back to your first book and you
torture.
read it. Yeah, I just can't stand that. I can't. It drives me nuts,
Well, speaking of, short stories, and then you have your novels, do you consider yourself a natural short story writer, a natural novelist? Do you have a preference?
Well, David, I'm not quite sure, because I did write a lot of short stories. I have a collection, Fog and Other Stories, and I have had quite a few others published. But I tend to think I like the longer form better, just because maybe I'm garrulous. I don't know. I just feel like it's a good, rich meal to write a novel. It's not just a little quick bite. And though I think short stories are wonderful, and I always advise young writers to write short stories first to discover their style and, to learn. And I just did actually write a couple of short stories last spring, which was the first time in a while. I think I'm more of a novelist, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
How do you know when a book's done?
When it sounds done. You know how in a symphony or classical music, at the ending, you hear this dun, dun, dun bump. There's just like
Cadence. Yeah.
It's done. And you know it. And words and lines at the end, that last paragraph, should be like that, like music. And I will fuss and fiddle for days, sometimes switching sentences around, changing words, trying to get that feeling of done. It's over. It's complete. It's finished. I think it's one of the most difficult parts about writing is to write an ending that feels finished.
Oh. So, if someone has never heard of you or read any of your books, and you were to give them one book, what book would you give them?
Probably Once Upon an Island. Yeah, I think that's the one I'm proudest of. Maybe it's just the most recent one, but I think because that is my big book in a sense of it's got a lot of stuff in it, and I like the characters tremendously well. I think they're very interesting. St. Croix is a magnificent and varied island. And not a lot of people have been there, actually. They've been to St. Thomas and some in St. John, but St. Croix is very unusual. So that would be the book that I would probably suggest in terms, and that's, more of a literary work. Doublecrossed is great fun for psychological suspense, and I think that that's a good one. And I also have written some young adult, and The Outcast Oracle would be my favorite of that group.
So what other works would you compare yourself to when it comes to psychological suspense? Like what kind of, how would you describe that to people?
Well, when I first started writing, Patricia Highsmith was a big influence. And what I loved about her work was that sort of spiderweb feeling where the semi-innocent main character would stumble into a mess. And then that web would get tighter and tighter and tighter until he or she couldn't get out again, not without really being in danger or without a disaster. So although Highsmith stylistically isn't like my writing, I tend to be a little more literary. I think Highsmith today, if she'd been alive today and put down the bottle, she would have probably written a little differently than she did back then, because she got away with a lot of writing that was not top notch, but her ideas were so good, and she was so wonderfully creepy that I think she was a really good beginning writer for me to look at. So I would say that was one writer that really influenced me. And the other one, who's absolutely different, is Virginia Woolf, who sort of brought out my literary feelings and my willingness to write the longer, slower novel, which is completely different than psychological suspense, where you're supposed to, put the hook in the mouth right in the first paragraph.
Yeah. So you're going to take up drinking?
I sort of stopped just because I'm bored with it. Well, I still grab a little Prosecco now and then, but.
So where do you see yourself going with this writing career? Like, what do you have plans for yourself?
Well, I have 3 manuscripts out to various publishers right now, and depending on where they go, that will take me in different directions. And I have a project that is, I'm on my 20th, I just finished my 20th round of a manuscript yesterday. And that'll be a psychological suspense. So I really don't know. I mean, I'm at the point now where I really wish I could have, started back when I didn't go to Bennington and changed everything, because publishing back then was a much different business than it is now. And without an agent, which I had one briefly, but he was elderly and we parted ways. Without an agent and without being picked up by, a trade house, you're really stuck. I mean, there's a huge gap between the small traditional houses and a trade house. So I'm finding myself sort of caught in between, which isn't really a very comfortable place. And I don't really know how to, get out of it. And I think many writers are in the same position that I'm in right now.
Yeah, I think that's the nature of the beast right now, and Amazon's really changed the world of publishing, and the internet and social media and all that. Do you find that there's a lot more involved in marketing these days?
I've watched that change dramatically, even over the number of years I've been publishing. It used to be that some publishers, smaller houses, had their publicist or were willing to hire one at their expense. Now that's happening less and less, if ever. And the onus has totally, almost completely shifted to the author. And, this is really, it's asking a lot, because at least from my side, I am not the type that loves to sit and talk about my work. I just want to get it done. So it's really a slog for me to have to approach reviewers and bloggers and podcasters and print media and say either, would you review the book? I mean, it's just very uncomfortable. It comes much better from another party. But this is the way it is, because these small publishers don't have any budget for this. And so they expect more and more of their writers to have platforms and well-established social media contacts. And I have quite a few, and I certainly do my best, but it's sort of the antithesis of what I want to do, what I'm really comfortable doing. And I think that's true of many writers.
Yeah, it's a completely different side of writing, because you have to talk to people like us. It's terrible.
Well, I'm lucky that there are people like you who are so kind to do this, because These podcasts are wonderful ways of dealing with promotion and meeting new people like yourselves. And I'm really grateful, considering, how much difficulty it is to have to keep up with all these different writers and read books and do that kind of thing.
Oh, it's insane. It's insane, especially as you get older and you can't see, and then you have to listen to books. But that's a different story. So now you brought up a subject before we were on air, and I think that's really kind of an interesting thing. So you're talking about bridge writing. So maybe talk about that a little bit.
Okay, well, I do consider myself a bridge writer in two ways. One, I don't just stick to one genre, which I think most writers do, stay within an area, and that's partly because publishers want them to keep, if they've had success, they want them to keep churning out similar kinds of books so they can establish a readership and a market. I have written young adult, I have written literary, I have written psychological suspense, a romance, and a comedy. Fabulous. I write the book that seems to want to be written, the one that comes to me, rather than think about who am I writing this book for. The other area that I feel like I'm a bridge writer is I don't necessarily have a baked-in audience. Some of my books are completely for heterosexual readers in the sense that the characters are completely heterosexual and the plots are too. Some are published by lesbian or gay presses, and just by accident, because I have some gay characters in there. On occasion, I mix the two. I really feel like I just sort of write between those areas and for those different readers. And as a result, it's sort of tough to pin me down and say, well, I'm this kind of writer or I'm that kind of writer. And I'm best read by these people. I don't think that way. I really have a lot of range, and that's what I take pleasure in. That's what I enjoy.
So now, are you big on social media? Do you interact with readers? Do you like doing that sort of thing, or do you do website? How do you have yourself set up now?
Well, I'm frequently on Facebook, and I also have a website, which is my name, Laury Egan, and it's .com. I am on Twitter, though I'm a little uncomfortable about being on Twitter these days. I do occasional Instagram posts, and I have a blog. I also maintain authors pages at Authors Guild in New York, Poets and Writers, Amazon, Goodreads, and other places. So I would say, I pretty much keep up with what's going on, and I'm always happy to hear from readers or to answer questions. I think that's just a lot of fun. I'm always fascinated listening to what people's thoughts are about various books, or even books I haven't written myself. That's a great pleasure.
So do you like to go through your reviews? Do you like to read reviews, and are you stay up on that, or do you just totally stay away from it?
I will absolutely read them, because I think it's something that gives you some information, some feedback, because I don't have a lot of beta readers that read my work. I have a few. So I don't always get a lot of information about what I've done. And so, yes, as long as it's a constructive review, even if it's slightly negative, I'd like to know about it. I'd like to read it. Yes.
Do you hunt them down, kill them in your book?
Not really, but usually
Not
I'll
really.
get a link. I'll get a link to a review that may be from a journal or someplace that I have requested a review, so I'll read it then. And occasionally I'll look at Amazon just because I just want to know how active the book is in terms of sales. But I don't go out of my way. But these things, I usually hear about them one way or the other.
Oh, geez, I look for them. I take them out. No, that's there. Anybody you want to work with? Any other writer or someone out there that you've sort of seen that you kind of go, wow, that would be really awesome?
Yeah, a couple of writers I would love to sit down and have that old glass of Prosecco with. Kate Atkinson is one of my very favorite writers. She just makes me laugh. She writes wonderful mysteries. And I would say, she would be a favorite of mine. I would love to talk to her. There are a bunch of others. I've been reading a lot of Scandinavian noir authors these days. I'm just finished a Joe Nesbo book, and so some of them I would like to talk to. And I would be totally flummoxed, but I would love to be able to sit down with Virginia Woolf and talk to her or listen to her.
And are you going to write any kind of weird? Are you going to be writing horror or anything like that in the future?
I have no idea. I tend to write I've written 2 books that have magical realism in them. The Swimmer was one, and I have a 2 partly linked novellas that I'm sending out to publishers right now. So the magical realism thing has sort of intrigued me a little bit. And of course, those are literary books. So I might do that again. I have an idea about a person who's watching an opera who gets involved and interested in an opera singer. And that might be sort of a Nightwood, like the Juno Barnes kind of thing, a little along those lines. I'm not sure, but I might go back to that after I finish the current project. But in terms of getting into something really different, no, I don't think I would.
No, too much work. too much agonizing, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly interesting. And now, of course, we're going to have we'll put your website up and all that so people can find you and one click. They don't have to worry about spelling your name correctly. They can just do it. Well, it's great. So now, the books we've been talking about, of course, is Doublecrossed and Once Upon an Island. And our guest is the author of those and many more, which you should look, Laury Egan. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you both. It's been a lot of fun. Some great questions.
Thanks, Laury.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.